Vietnam, more than 50 years later, and it still lives in popular culture and in the minds of many. The war America lost, or so the liberals like to gleefully claim. They've attempted to equate every war since, too, perhaps in hopes of repeating history. But what really happened? Despite dozens of movies, games, and ridiculous media comparisons, how much do we really know? Those of us who are not there in person, that is. This is the politically incorrect history of the Vietnam War. The first thing we should do is look at the whole notion that Vietnam was a defeat. How does one determine a military defeat, or even a victory for that matter? What objective measures can be used? There are three that come to mind: the completion of objectives, the winning of battles, and kill to casualty ratio. The first one is the most important. Put simply, did we, the U.S., achieve our stated goals? Our goals are simple: defend democratic South Vietnam from the communist North and enable the South to survive on its own. Here's where images of helicopters taking off from our embassy roof or being pushed off the deck of an aircraft carrier during the fall of Saigon probably spring to mind. South Vietnam fell and its people were enslaved by the communist North. Clearly we failed, right? Wrong. The subject is the Vietnam War. American combat involvement in Vietnam began on March 8, 1965, and lasted until August 15, 1973. Saigon fell on April 30, 1975, nearly 2 full years after the U.S. ended combat operations. The war was already over at that time, as far as the U.S. was concerned anyway. So what about our objectives? We achieved them. The North Vietnamese signed the Paris Peace Accords on January 27, 1973, thus ending the war. A North Vietnamese supplied insurgency still existed in the South, but the North agreed to end direct military involvement, thus enabling the U.S. to begin gradually withdrawing troops as counterinsurgency operations were taken up by the South Vietnamese army. That the North later reneged on this agreement is inconsequential to the question, because by that time the U.S. had withdrawn, having met our goals. We simply chose not to enforce the ceasefire. Second and third measure go nearly hand in hand. The U.S. won every single battle, and in doing so inflicted vastly disproportionate casualties on the North. But what about the Tet Offensive? I can hear the liberals screeching. Yes, I'm talking about you there in the hemp oil-stained Shea shirt, and you in the ugly-ass horn ring glasses, and all your little left-wing buddies. You're totally predictable. The Tet Offensive was a surprise attack by the North, which made initial gains and provided much footage that was run constantly on the evening news, and provided propaganda to the American and global left. Both used it to try to claim that the war was unwinnable, and still fuels their defeat fantasy today. The fact, however, is that the Tet Offensive failed. The U.S. won, beating back the North and reclaiming all losses. Moreover, it effectively broke the North. The Viet Cong were all but annihilated, and the North Vietnamese army never fully recovered until after the war, not being able to launch any more major offensives. In total, the U.S. suffered 58,220 killed in action, but the North Vietnamese suffered an estimated 1,100,000, meaning that for every one American who died, 18.9 North Vietnamese were killed. By all objective military measures, the U.S. won the war. But as you can see with the continued popularity of the war, that is not the only measure. The other is political. The political story was different. The U.S. was taken off guard by the size and intensity of the Soviet-backed hard-left communist sympathizing counterculture and anti-war movement, i.e. the hippies. In past wars, and indeed at the start of the Vietnam War, there was great support on the home front. It was, and remains, one of our great strengths as a country. In times of war, we can put aside our differences and support the war effort. We can disagree, but we are at least on the same side, and we certainly would not actively work against our own country or provide aid and comfort to the enemy. And not so with the new left. For the first time, we had to deal with a large and organized fifth column at home. Supposed Americans that not only opposed the war, but actively supported the enemy. One can argue the possible causes of the sedition, overly permissive parenting during an economic boom time, parents who grew up hard and wanted to spoil their children, or active recruiting and support efforts by Soviet agents, or perhaps a bit of both. Yuri Bezmenov actually provides some wonderful insight into the question. Bezmenov was a former KGB agent who was tasked with just those sorts of activities, namely infiltrating and undermining the U.S. and the West, but he defected and brought his knowledge with him. If you have never seen his interview, I would highly recommend that you watch it. It's fascinating and also provides a frightening look into the Soviet strategy and goes a long way toward explaining not just the counterculture and anti-war movements of the Vietnam era, but even the present state of the American left. His information is backed up by other known sources, including the publications of our own domestic left, such as Saul Alinsky and his Rules for Radicals. To summarize very briefly, so I don't get too much more off track, the plan was to infiltrate American schools, and especially universities, to slowly indoctrinate and ultimately subvert impressionable young minds and take advantage of their youthful fervor and lack of life experience, as well as the media, who would start censoring out information and views damaging to the left and their narrative, while spreading communist propaganda to the masses. The goal being to slowly cause a fundamental change in American culture, weaken or subvert our institutions, damage or cripple the U.S. economy and military, and create enough chaos, misery, and cultural and moral destruction to create an environment ripe for a communist takeover. Take a good look around you now. We have an openly one-sided media that makes up fake news and politicizes our entertainment, college professors who beat people they disagree with bike locks, teaching our kids, and so much moral depravity and confusion that we have people that can't even figure out which bathroom to use. And God help you if you offend one of the snowflakes or intrude into their safe space. But I'm off topic. Watch the Bezmenov interview. The point in that little spiel is that the same forces were at play then. More subtle, but it was driving an American fifth column against the war. The constant drumbeat, literally, and disruption of the protests, combined with the deliberately defeatist media, was creating a political problem and pressure at home on our weak-willed and empty-headed politicians who increasingly sought to cut and run from the war. We even had traitorous celebrities like Jane Fonda, who went on unmounted USO tours for the enemy, and proudly posed for propaganda photos sitting on anti-aircraft guns used to shoot at our own planes. Not to mention deliberate acts of domestic terrorism and sabotage committed at home by the same activists, including the terrorist bombing campaign committed by Obango's friend and admitted mentor, Bill Ayers. And yes, I deliberately mispronounced that communist's name. The result was that the U.S. was forced to use ineffective half measures and ultimately signed a premature peace agreement and pull out before the South was ready. And the result of that was the fall of Saigon and those images of helicopters landing on our embassy and getting pushed off of carriers, which we discussed earlier. Emboldened by their victory in Vietnam, the leftists continued the same tactic in every American war since then, desperate to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. We can thank those tactics for our early withdrawal from Iraq, which caused the rise of ISIS. There were other problems with the war as well, some of them related, but others not. We had a high percentage of demoralized draftees thanks to the efforts of the left. We also had planners trying to fight a war by the numbers and trying to lead and micromanage from the top, which hamstrung commanders in the field, partly because of casualty-averse politicians and media, and partly from incompetence. And related to that was an overly restrictive set of rules of engagement, again intended to create a more photogenic and clean war, all the while giving the enemy room to operate in an ill-advised strategy of trying to win the hearts and minds of the enemy. Had the more aggressive operations and heavy bombing campaigns of the late war been authorized sooner, we likely would not be discussing this. The same goes for if we had just bombed out the North's rice paddies and starved them out versus trying to win their hearts and minds. War is ugly. Robert E. Lee once said, "It is good that war is so terrible, lest we grow too fond of it." And he was right. In war, people are killed and things get broken, including loss of innocent people and other collateral damage. That is the nature of war. We cannot change that, and by trying to sanitize it, We only succeed in tying our own hands, while our enemies have no such restrictions. It doesn't just put us at a disadvantage, it also prolongs the war, and ultimately causes much more destruction and misery than if we had just used total war and gone in heavy and got it done to begin with. It's like trying to stop an oil well fire with a hose. All you're doing is wasting water. You have to blow it up and blast out the fire. Sure, you destroy the well, that was going to happen anyway. But now you can not only get back to work, but you don't have to risk your firefighters' lives. If anything, the terrible nature of war is its ultimate deterrent. If you make war clean, you will do nothing but ensure endless war. Lee was right. I hope that you've learned something, that you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please like and subscribe and let me know your thoughts in the comment section. If you want to see more videos like this, please consider visiting my Patreon page in the link in the description. Everything helps, even if it's only $1 or $2, and I appreciate it all. Thank you.